this. So I know we have a short amount of time. We're going to try to be brief here, but this is obviously quite a big topic right now in the rugby world. We're going to be talking about transgender inclusion in the sport of rugby, and specifically focusing on some of the myths that are out there around, the science of trans inclusion and where trans women in particular fit into the sport, and how we can, build allyship within such a wonderful organization like International Gay Rugby. So I will do a quick introduction between the two of us. We'll talk about where a lot of the sort of hysteria and the concern around trans athletes and specifically trans women in sports and rugby has come from. Then we're going to spend a lot of time digging into the science here. So there's a lot of talk about competitive advantages, and there's a lot of assumptions and myths out there, which we're going to hope to dispel through this presentation. We'll talk a little bit about the science, and then we'll also discuss some of the politics of this topic and what the rhetoric looks like right now. Most importantly, I think at the end, we want to have a bit of a question and answer session, and we're very happy to answer any questions that folks have. But a little bit about myself. So my name is Grace McKenzie. I'm from Niagara Falls, Canada, was born and raised there, but I currently live in San Francisco, California, and I've been playing rugby for about 3 years now. So I currently play as flanker, and most recently I played for the San Francisco Golden Gate Women's Rugby Club, but currently working on chartering a new club within IGR within the Bay Area for our women's side, which we're excited for. And outside of just playing and the work that I do, I'm also a strong advocate for trans inclusion in sport as a trans woman myself.
Yeah, and hi, sorry my camera for some reason is not working, but my name's Shoshauna Gauvin. I'm from Halifax, Canada originally. My background in rugby, I've played since high school in men's. I played university as in men's team, and then I've played varsity rugby as a woman, competing for both Queen's University and the University of Guelph, which are both top-rated teams nationally in Canada, and several of the Team Canada World Cup and/or Olympic team athletes are on that type of squad. And I personally have a research interest in sports diversity and sports management. I'm doing a thesis project currently on this topic, and I was on a research group over the summer that made recommendations to the Canadian Centre of Ethics in Sports, which is our anti-doping organization, for trans inclusion policy. And we did a complete literature review of all the science that pertains to this topic at that time.
So I want to talk a little bit about how trans athletes and trans people in general get sort of discussed verbatim. So, Athlete Ally, a phenomenal organization which advocates for trans and queer inclusion in sport, did an assessment of the most high-performing content on trans topics. And out of 225 pieces they reviewed, more than 65% of those pieces came from media sources which had sort of a right-leaning bias that specifically were anti-trans inclusion in sport and anti-trans rights. And this is very important because trans people more often than not get talked about in the abstract and very often get talked to about these topics in terms of our experience and how we sort of live in the world, which makes it very easy for people to form assumptions that are often incorrect about the transgender experience and where we fit into society. This conversation has very broadly been about this idea of protecting women's sport, this idea that women's sport is something very fragile and needs protection from the outside world to exist. And we see this coming from a number of organizations like, for example, Fair Play for Women based in the UK, which are recognized and known as trans exclusionary radical feminist organizations, which talk about trans inclusion as sport as one very small wedge issue in a much larger campaign against trans inclusion in society more generally. So they also fight for things like keeping trans women in men's prisons, rolling back the Gender Recognition Act, a variety of different areas where trans folks are fighting for rights and inclusion in society. These organizations, they have a sister organization called Save Women's Sports in the US. They're oftentimes funded and backed by large right-leaning think tanks like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is actually recognized by the Southern Poverty Law Center here in the States as a hate organization within the United States of America. The same organization, Alliance Defending Freedom, is also the organization behind over 100 pieces of legislation that has flown through different sort of state legislatures across the United States this year, many of them specifically targeting trans youth in sports and transgender girls and women participating in sports across the country. This has also fed into a larger hysteria in the rugby world around where transgender athletes belong in our sport, with World Rugby culminating in a very hasty decision to ban trans women from the elite level of the game, sort of across the International Federation for the sport. Luckily, here in the United States and also in Canada and a number of other national unions around the world, the national unions themselves have come out in support of trans inclusion and against World Rugby's quite politically motivated policy to ban trans women from the game. And World Rugby's decision has not just been criticized by folks who are advocates for trans inclusion, but by a significant portion of the academic community and large, well-known sort of professional athletes like Megan Rapinoe and others who see trans inclusion in sport as a way to actually grow women's sports holistically and include more people in sport as the games continue to grow.
So now we're going to talk a bit about some of the assumptions that are created around the biologic advantage and what some of the actual reality on these the situation is. Next slide, please. So in order to understand this, I think it's really important to understand women's sports as a whole. Up until the 20th century, women just were not allowed to play sports at all. We only really got the opportunity to play sports, starting with golf and tennis and a few other, track and field type events. And really that only took off in the 1900s. And even then, women participation rates were exceptionally low during this period of time. And in 1936, there was a suspected medal sweep of intersex athletes, which resulted in high levels of restrictions targeting intersex and people of color. And this, in large part, had to do with the idea that sports represented society. We see this, in the German Olympics, where the state, didn't want Black athletes from America competing because they believed, of racial supremacy and that the athletes were supposed to represent, the best that humans could be. And so by targeting women and who they considered not to be real women or who wasn't feminine enough to be portrayed in this role, they control the experience of not just trans athletes and intersex athletes, but all women on what roles they can fill in society. Next slide, please. So this misogyny in sport has been largely displayed as how much better men's sports is than women's sports. And this is a graph over time of performance of men and women's running times. And you can see from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there was a very large difference in performance times. And this graph, when you take it out, it keeps that trend where these differences keep increasing over time. This is almost entirely due to participation rates. As more people compete, you're more likely to get higher, better athletes. And when you look at the elite level, you're only selecting the top few of the best performers. And so the more people that participate, the better results you end up getting over time. And so largely this represents that. And it's interesting to note that it's not just in women's sports that are physical, but in chess as well. We see the same progression where women chess players underperform men purely due to, when you take statistics to it, because of participation rates, and there's just fewer women compared to men, so that the average performance decreases as a result. Additionally, there's other performance effects that underestimate the total potential that women may be able to perform at. Besides participation rates, there's body expectations. Women are expected to adhere to a ideal of femininity, which emphasizes flexibility, muscle tone, and slimness over bulking. And this translates into how women eat and train and what activities they participate in. This is especially true in labor markets where women are vastly underrepresented in skilled trades and construction, and also in police and military roles where individuals are expected to train and bulk muscle mass to perform those jobs, and by doing those jobs tend to increase muscle mass. And this again extends to gender roles in sports. We found even in dance, the roles that women and men play in sport are vastly different. Men tend to take roles that have an idea of what men should be, the lifter, the strength of the performance, and the women must be slim and small in order to be the one lifted. Next slide, please. The other interesting part of this is that sports historically segregated by gender for social, political, and cultural reasons. They're not actually practical limitations. If you actually adjust for fat-free mass and height, uh, all existing performance advantages after you remove participation rates largely evaporate, and this includes in weightlifting activities. Segregation in sports largely justified because men are on average taller than women and can safely carry less body fat for the equivalent level of power. But it's interesting to note that we don't consider height to be an unfair advantage, and that being taller doesn't disqualify you from competing. The opposite's true in the NBA. Everybody in the NBA is vastly taller than the average man. And that when we talk about sport performance for trans women, we only ever talk about testosterone, but estrogen is the primary hormone that regulates body fat. And when trans women take estrogen, they increase body fat percentage similar to cis women, which makes that second piece very critical to assess as well. Next slide, please. This is a detailed chart of individual activities at the elite level and the difference in performance between. In endurance type activities, we see about a 10%, 10 to 13% difference. And in activities that are single shot activities, think 1 rep max strength type outputs, you can see as high as a 50% advantage. Some of this, though, is actually misleading in that it's not adjusted for height again. And so things like a baseball pitch, the length of someone's arm affects how fast you can pitch the ball. And so if you don't adjust for height, those are also not always the most accurate. But you can still see that the differences between what men and women can perform at, if we say about 15%, that'll be just important when we look at the biological evidence later. Next slide, please.
Great. So I think one of the very important things to recognize as well is oftentimes when trans women in sport get discussed, they're discussed with a quite hyperbolic image that is portrayed by media that again talks about us in the abstract. So more often than not, they use a very hyper-masculinized or stereotypical image of a larger or heavier or more muscular sort of trans woman athlete, when in reality within the trans feminine population, there's such a diversity of body sizes, shapes, performance advantages. And when you actually think about the physiology, which Shoshauna will talk about in a little bit later, if you are correcting for height, but considering the fact that trans women who go through hormone regimens typically have higher body fat percentages and lower muscle mass, that sort of height or the density of somebody's body, if you don't have the muscular strength to propel it, oftentimes becomes a disadvantage. So it's quite a misleading image that is often portrayed and doesn't really represent the diversity that exists within the trans feminine population. So a lot of the assumption that is made here is that all people assigned male at birth are bigger, faster, and stronger than people assigned female at birth, and that this almost exclusively has to do with testosterone. And this is a fallacy because, again, individuals, there's such a diversity of advantages or disadvantages depending on the sport that you play, based on so many other things besides your hormones, including your genetics, social advantages or disadvantages that might create barriers to sport. And it's very sort of misleading to just boil this down to such a simple assumption like this. In reality, the sort of generalized effects that testosterone actually has on the body for somebody assigned male at birth or somebody who has something like an intersex characteristic, it's quite limited. And these are effects that are almost entirely negated based on things like hormone replacement therapy. So most of this is about height, the density of your bones, things like red blood cell production, and things like height and bone density are not reversible through hormonal processes, but actually become disadvantages when you're thinking about the decrease in muscle density, the decrease in strength that comes from a hormone regimen that replaces testosterone with estrogen. And you can actually see this in characteristics of different sports and the overlap between sort of hormonal ranges between cis men and cis women. There is actually a considerable amount of overlap in different sports between cis men and cis women based on their endogenous testosterone levels. It's not this like sort of doubly sided histogram where you have a large gap in between. There's more similarity than difference often than not. You can also see this in things like height, for example. We're often told that men are on average always taller than women. And in reality, there is quite a lot of overlap, which you can see among elite athletes like this in the purple zones of these charts. As Shosh was talking about here, we don't actually control for height in sports as something that confers competitive advantage. You can look at things like the 2016 high jump final. You had an 8.5-inch difference between the competitor from the Netherlands and the competitor from Indonesia, but nobody was claiming that this was an unfair competition because this was between two cis women, not between a cis woman and a trans woman. We consider these sorts of competitive advantages as fair within sport already. However, the same courtesy is not extended to trans people who are competing in sport. And again, to reiterate this, different body types and skills lend themselves to different sports. There is not a single athlete who's going to excel at all sports because there's so many characteristics that go into determining whether you can be an elite athlete within a sport. And I think this is extremely relevant to the game of rugby, where you have such a diversity in positions and skill sets that allow you to exceed at one role, but probably not exceed at another. Think about a prop versus a scrum half. And we can actually see this in the Olympics themselves. So if you look at female Olympic ski jumping and shooting, when these sports were originally introduced into the Olympics and there wasn't gender segregation, female ski jumpers and female shooters often outperformed men, and the regulations or the actual structure of those events were changed, or the genders were segregated to reinforce the idea that men are consistently and on average better than women at all sports, which really is a fallacy if you look at sports across the board. As a sport in rugby, we know this. We all play this sport. Rugby players come in all different shapes and sizes. You can see the difference here between an elite level lock and an elite level scrum half. We don't consider this to be unfair when these two teams go up against each other, or unsafe, or any of these other sorts of things, because we recognize that rugby is a game that's designed to enable players of all different shapes, sizes, and body types to compete fairly and safely with each other. More examples here from other teams around the world. Great. Another assumption that is made is that if we allow transgender athletes to compete in women's sports, that trans women in particular will take over women's sports and remove opportunities away from cis women. If you actually look at the data, however, trans women and trans people in general have been allowed to compete at the highest level of sport for almost 20 years now, since 2003, when the first International Olympic Committee policy was introduced. Up until the Tokyo Olympics this year, there hasn't been a single transgender athlete who has competed openly on the world stage. And even in this Olympics, where we actually had one of the first trans women competitors, ever sort of compete for a medal, not a single trans woman has stood on the podium at the Olympics, when there's been over 54,000 Olympians who have competed since the beginning of the Olympic Games. In reality, there are many real and documented threats to women's sports, but these come down to things like a lack of resources, a lack of investment in coaching, in training, in media representation, and also high rates of things like sexual harassment and sexual assault. Transgender teammates are not the threat that they're made out to be by media that really looks to just politicize our identity as trans people. I'll toss it over to Shosh to continue here.
So, having trans women participate in sport is often cited as a safety concern, people are going to end up getting hurt if this is allowed. So we'll look at the actual science behind this one. So the reality is that red blood cell count after undergoing testosterone suppression is normalized within 4 months. These are multiple studies that confirm this, so that one of the major advantages that is used for endurance activities and in a sport like rugby where you have to play 80 minutes is the same for trans women and cis women after 4 months of hormone therapy. We see a 3 to 9.5% muscle loss in non-athletes within the first 12 months. And this, again, because it's non-athletes, tend to be more sedentary at baseline. The interesting thing about this is that these trans women start with 6.5 to 8% less lean body mass, and 6 to about 11% less muscle size than cis men do. So when you add up the 3 to 9.5% plus the 6.5 to 8% differences, you have about that 15 to 20% difference that I mentioned earlier for you guys to think about and remember of what the difference in performance advantage was supposed to be. And so we often look at these studies and say it's not fair that trans women play because, you know, they only lost 3 to 9.5% muscle loss, but trans women start with less body mass, particularly because trans women, because of this dysphoria, tend to under eat nutrition. They also tend to engage in activities that lean themselves out to try to appear more feminine. Next slide, please. So this extends to just poor science. The research and communication in this area is highly politicized and has been used actively for fundraising efforts, particularly for the Republican Party. We found that when this becomes a wedge issue, Republican donations increase dramatically. There's also an epidemic in this research field with using poor methods, such as hand grip strength, which is known to not be able to be used as a proxy for strength, and yet is one of the basis for examining this topic. Another example for this is bone density. We heard earlier that bone density is affected by testosterone. This is quoted regularly in anti-trans documents and news sources, but the reality is that white men have lower bone density, than black women do. And so the idea that bone density in itself confers an advantage is without any proof, because if that was the case, then black women would have some kind of performance advantage over white men. And that's simply not true, because the differences between genders for bone density is less than the differences between genetic variation around world population. Next slide, please. So this is a really good example. In a presentation that was made, we looked at by Harper, who's one of the leading trans researchers examining this topic. They examined the difference in hand grip strength, and they found that trans women retain about a 15% advantage over cis women in hand grip strength. However, I believe this was Emma Hilton who reported this. Cis men versus cis women retain about a 55% advantage. So which one of these numbers do you think was publicized? It was publicized as trans women retain a 15% advantage over cis women, not that, you know, over 70% of the advantage had been eliminated, and the maintenance of grip strength, that remaining 15%, is almost entirely likely to do with the fact that trans women tend to have larger hands than cis women, and larger hands are able to grip the testing device easier, and therefore exert more power for the same muscular strength. Next slide. And so the World Rugby ban was justified on the use of car crash software to simulate a crash between an average cis man tackling an average cis woman. And then they found that led to an increased risk. However, they didn't evaluate that collision between two cis women of similar weight differences either. And remember, cis men and cis women vary largely based off of height and weight. So if you adjust for height, it eliminates a lot of this error. This would be like asking that a 5'4" person is going to be at increased risk due to a 5'8" person tackling them. Of course, the larger person is going to exert more force. Similarly to this, we have lots of report from concussion testing from football, the NFL, and rugby themselves, World Rugby themselves, showing that it's actually speed on contact is far higher associated with injury and concussion than mass. And so it's internally misleading and purposely misleading for multiple different angles. Next slide, please.
Great.
And that's it.
Yeah, so want to open the floor now to question and answer to see if anybody has any questions about what we went through here. And both Shosh and I are very happy to discuss. Shosh is obviously a little bit more sort of in the science here, doing active research on the topic, but we're both open to talk about the science and our experiences as trans women in rugby.
First of all, I want to thank you for such an impeccable presentation. I was so informative and so well presented that really done. You have done yourself really, really well done. I want to thank you for that. There is another session that Julius, you should be on it, starting now. So this session will continue if you want to continue a question and answer. Well, I will ask you, which we have not been able to do before on the other ones, and they kept recording. Just make sure you stop the recording. And Grace, I'm sure you know how to do that. Under the 3 dots, there is a stop recording red button.
Okay, let me see. So it's grayed out on my side. I think whoever the host of this meeting is needs to. Yeah.
Should be the host of the meeting, but I guess for some reason it came in as a guest. Okay, well, I will just make sure that the other meeting starts well, and I'll come back to this one if there's any question. And if you're gone, I will end the meeting and end the recording. Thank you so much. I have tons of questions, but I personally ran out of time. I'm sure some of the people in the audience may have some questions for you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you. Great. Allyship from gay men. So
thanks, Grace. Thanks, Shoshauna.
Happy to.
I put a little statement there, yeah, because I practice martial arts, and when this whole thing broke out last year, I had attended Fallon Fox's induction into the National LGBT Hall of Fame in Chicago way back when, and so we touched base again. And I was like, yeah, they're always showing the video of you knocking out your competitor, but no, somehow they always forget to include the videos of you getting knocked out by your competitors. And Fallon was like just laughing about it, yeah. So yeah, that's all I wanted to point out.
It's such an interesting topic. It's such an interesting topic because so my mother was actually a world champion fighter for Taekwondo. And did a bit of mixed martial arts as well. So I grew up in that environment. And back in the day, there was no segregation based off of weight. There was no weight classes in most MMA or martial arts categories. And that was just, we never had an issue with that as an unfair advantage. And yet, when we see this representation between like trans individuals, all of a sudden we have this giant outcry. And it's interesting how that sport, particularly in fighting, tends to lead itself into some of the most aggressive conversations on this topic. And I think it's because of the combative nature of the sport, and the assumption that women are just at all weights and all sizes just inferior to men.
I agree. I do see a question. I know Julius had to leave, but this is a really good question that we didn't get into in the presentation. And this is around allyship, specifically from gay men, and how gay men can advocate for trans women in the sport without quote unquote mansplaining. I think the most important thing that folks who are not transgender themselves but want to align themselves with the cause and be allies can do is speak to trans people first and foremost and hear about our lived experiences within the sport. I did mention this earlier, but we get talked about in the abstract so often that I think our personal experiences, both from like physiologically what we go through as folks who take hormones and undertake medical transition, but also just our experience in sports. One of my, I think, interesting perspectives, and Shosh as well, like coming from men's sports to women's sports and seeing the disparities that exist, not just in terms of things like physicality, but in terms of resources, in terms of funding, in terms of, just the representation of women's sports in general, we have quite a unique perspective on the matter. So I think talking to trans people is very important here. And I think generally speaking, raising your voice about this as queer people, as gay people, we've all faced discrimination, we've all faced exclusion, we've all faced, these sorts of things that hold us back from being our most authentic selves. I don't think it's difficult to empathize with the transgender experience as people of different sort of queer identities. So the more voices that we can have in unison on this topic, the better. But it's important to obviously discuss with the folks who have firsthand experience before you can be an ally and be vocal and be supportive out there in the public sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, even from my own personal experience playing rugby, I played university rugby as a man, and I played, almost every game that way. And then when I transitioned, I started playing women's rugby at a different university. All of a sudden I became a second string player. And I was a second string player not because of transphobia. My coach was exceptionally accepting and great about everything. It was just because the other girls were just better than I was. And so it's this interesting idea that, we have. And I think the biggest thing when we talk about this topic is not to talk about transphobia in of itself, but talk about just the blatant misogyny in sport. Because if we can tackle the misogyny in sport, I think we start tackling transphobia in sport as a result as well. Because if we don't see men as inherently superior than women, then a lot of these issues go away, I think, by themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we have another really great question here. So I don't have your name, unfortunately, but it's from somebody from the Baltimore Flamingos who's trans themselves, a rugby player. And they're talking about policy where, a men's team, quote unquote, but an inclusive men's team is open to all trans people, trans men, trans women, non-binary folks, as long as they find the team to be the most comfortable place. And this person is asking whether that is a supportive and inclusive policy. And I think it absolutely is. Like, transition in and of itself is a journey, and it's different for every single trans person, trans women included. And I think at different stages along your journey, you may feel more or less comfortable playing with a team that is more aligned with men or aligned with women. I think as somebody who's medically transitioned, there definitely was a point after about that year process for me on hormones where I would have very much so not felt comfortable or safe sort of playing on a quote unquote men's team and felt safer on a women's team. But I think having the door be open where folks can make that decision and sort of self-select for where they feel most comfortable and most sort of included is the best path forward. But I'm curious what your opinion is on the matter, Shosh.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So about like that idea of like, performance over time, definitely my own transition has resulted in me being substantially weaker. I mean, when I was in the army, I used to bench press 315 pounds, and now, I'm lucky if I'm bench pressing, 185. I have substantially lost strength in some regards, even though I train very hard to maintain that. But the interesting thing about it is that about 2 years ago, right before the pandemic hit, I was invited to play a co-ed game of like recreational rugby in town. And up until that point, I had not injured a single girl playing rugby. And I played this co-ed game, and one of the guys was being a bit of a jerk and kind of like going into contact against some women in rucks, kind of in a bit of an unsafe manner. And the game was supposed to be like fun and light sported. It wasn't really supposed to be like full contact in any regards. And so I lined him up and I tackled him when he had the ball, and I actually dislocated his shoulder. And everyone was kind of shocked. And so the only injury I've caused on the field in the past, 4 years was against a man. And it's because he was a very bad player and he didn't know how to go into contact. And like, this is the actual risk. And so, yes, I'm weaker. If I wanted to go play competitive elite men's rugby, I wouldn't be able to. But at a recreation level, I'm confident I could go into a Division 2 or Division 3 men's team and be able to compete. Or at least play and enjoy the sport and play. Maybe I wouldn't be a prop. Maybe I'd be a flanker or some other role. But I'm confident that there would be a opportunity for me to play, and I could play likely in a safe method. There's always players on fields that are not very strong or not very, and so there's always that opportunity. I think in terms of policy, I think it's I think it's perfectly fine if on a men's team, if people want to identify as they will. I will say, however, the opposite is not necessarily true. That I do believe that trans women should probably undergo some form of testosterone suppression before competing in a live match against other women, specifically because of the red blood cell count in the first 6 to 8 months does experience a fairly rapid decrease in muscular strength. And I think this is a policy not necessarily entirely based on evidence, because there's lots of sociological evidence that says that the average trans woman is more representative to the cis women because of, nutrition and dysphoria and these things. But rather a social responsibility that you are ensuring that I think even from your own perspective that you've done your own due diligence. And so if you did go on the field and hurt someone, there wouldn't be an obvious reason that someone could challenge you for that. And I think thinking of my own time playing, if I went on the field before I started hormone therapy and had injured a woman, I probably would have thought for years if it was as the result of not taking hormone therapy. And so I'm very conflicted on whether or not that should be official policy, but I do recommend personally to trans women who ask this question of me that want to compete in combat sports or contact sports at a competitive level that a 6 to 12 month period, or I'd say 6 to 12, if not 6 to 8 for sure, month period is very well justified before competing. Whether or not that does not obviously extend to practice or social events or anything like that. And they should be highly encouraged to practice with the teams and whatnot. But at the competitive nature, I think there is justification to protect not just you, but other people, and also the ability for other trans women to play the sport, because I think the political situation is untenable. And I think if serious injury happened on the field with someone that was pre-hormone therapy, I think that would be used as a political catalyst to, dissuade or make other trans women ineligible to play. So yeah, I'm not sure if that kind of answers the question. I feel like I kind of went on a few tangents there, but hopefully that kind of answered it.
Yeah, I think it's a very big question. I think it depends also if you're talking about competitive rugby or you're talking about social rugby as well. We see this debate when it comes to the legislation around trans children competing. Rugby Canada, I think, has a really phenomenal policy on the books right now about where people can kind of compete depending on where they're at in their transition, if they choose to medically transition or not. That's quite self-identity focused. But I think when we're talking about higher levels of competition where the risk of injury is greater and the stakes are higher, it gets a little bit more nuanced than that. At the end of the day, I think more research needs to be done in this topic, and we're seeing more and more papers come out that offer justification around the effects of hormone therapy, specifically on trans feminine participation. But the science is so sporadic and so politically motivated right now that it's a difficult place to form conclusive policy from.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. That the evidence that exists is not of particularly high quality. There's the red blood cell count is quite good, but like most of the strength metrics, to be frank, we don't have a very good idea on what time period is justified for high strength individuals undergoing hormone therapy. We just know that within a 2-year period that the vast majority of any retained advantage of testosterone leaves the body by that period of time. So yeah.
I don't see any other questions right now, but I don't know if anybody in the call had any.
We're way past your the allocated time, which I actually was so fascinated about your answers that I let it go because it was really interesting, everything you guys were talking about. I think that we do need to have a follow-up on this one, and I hope we'll do it soon, because I think that you guys are tapping onto things that are finally explaining to the rest of us things that we needed to know to understand better. It goes about a lot of that is important, and I'm glad we did this session, because now we're going to post it and have people be able to watch it at their own time, and hopefully have some of the question answered, and have other questions that I could bring for the next session. So
Well,
once again, thank you so much, both of you.
Really, I will say, just before we leave, if anybody does have questions or follow up, rugbyforall.co is a really great resource on this, transathlete.com, and please reach out to us. So feel free to share, either my email or Instagram handle, and folks can reach out to me directly with questions. I'm sure Shosh is open to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and including commentary. This is the first time we actually did this presentation, or at least for me, it definitely was. So even if you have commentary on how to make it more effective, or if there was pieces there that you thought might have been highlighted more, we were limited on time for sure. But if you have commentary, this is a topic that we talk about quite often. So I'm always open to figuring out how to communicate these ideas more effectively.
Great. Thank you so much.
I think the presentation was great. I think that perhaps one of the things I will say is just some of the slides were not completely clear to me, but we can go over it later if you want.
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right.
Enjoy.
Thank you guys so much.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.